Okay, welcome everybody. Glad we're here today, finally linking up with this amazing man. We've actually, if people don't realize, this actually is one of a few interviews I've done with Frank. This is Frank Jacob. Welcome everybody. Of course, this is the Space Water podcast where we dive into the sound of the light. My name is Ra Castaldo, and Frank and I was looking up before. Frank and I actually first did our first podcast together in 2015, so it's been 10 years since we first did an interview, and I think I might not have had him on since maybe 2020, 2019. So it's been a long time since we caught up, and I saw that he was talking about plasma recently as well. So this has been a topic that has been very special to me for a very long time, and we can maybe get into why today in the show. So everybody, if you're new to Frank on my channel, you're in for a treat. Frank has been around for a long time, writing books about esoteric work and his amazing research. His name is Frank Jacob. You guys can find his Ancient X Files and the Plasma Matrix book out now. And Frank will explain more about that and how he came into working with plasma during the interview. Frank, it's a pleasure to have you back on the Space Water podcast. Thank you for coming on today.
Great to see you, Ra. It's been a while. You're right, probably about 5 years since I think it probably was around 2020 since we last spoke. And I know we've been dancing around trying to hook up and get this date set, and finally we've done it. So there you are. Good to be here.
It's great to have you here, Frank. So before we even get into the plasma, uh, can you give my audience a little background of who you are and how you got into being an author about some of these topics?
Sure. Well, my authorship actually extends not into paper, but into the digital realm. As a creator, I create these things called master classes, I guess. They're courses. They started off being, webinars, and then they just kept, growing and expanding and going deeper. And that's kind of the latest chapter, but it was preceded by, and it is an ongoing thing that I do. I'm also a filmmaker. And the thing that you probably, I think, first connected me with is this right back there. There's a poster, if you can see that, where there's kind of a little guy there walking into the distance. That film is called
Yes,
Looking for Mars, and that was released in 2015.
the Mars. Yep.
And so I think I'm pretty certain we had conversations about that. And that film came after another film, which that my partner Tanya Maidenford and I did called Solar Revolution, which is also kind of a cult classic in the meantime, which talks about consciousness and the solar input, the sun and how the sun is affecting consciousness on this planet. And we also created a film on an interesting character out of Austria called Klaus Donna. He's an out-of-place artifacts researcher. So I've sort of been venturing into those directions. And I've been a media producer, I've been a musician, and I've sort of, branched into all kinds of areas, literally kind of focusing on these subjects that are sort of frontier science, as you might say. I like to call them frontier science. I used to call them fringe science, but that's got kind of a strange vibe to it, that word. They're just, cutting edge stuff that most people think is either not real, is science fiction, or belongs in the realms of paranormal activity. So, I find that a very interesting area to move in because I like to, A, document the phenomenon, and B, kind of put a grounded, approach to it, culminating in, I guess, something that has really fascinated me for the last 2 years or 3 years, I guess, by now, Gnosticism. And because Gnosticism also is something that requires you to be very grounded, because it's talking about spiritual things or cosmic things, which are really kind of very advanced. And you can very easily get carried away, as many people do, and start inventing and using your imagination in an incorrect way. So you kind of layer on top of things, a lot of fiction. So I'm about, that's why I call myself sometimes a consciousness archaeologist. I kind of dig down through the layers of invention and imagination and try to get to the root or the prime source documentation, if you will. So that's kind of a real nutshell in terms of what I've been doing. And thanks for mentioning the latest one I'm doing, Ancient X Files and the Plasma Matrix, because that one is really the mother of load of information. I got to say, and I think a lot of people are starting to realize that and are realizing that plasma and the connection of plasma to life is sort of like the future.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think people are gonna be intrigued to where we go today with this. And I'm glad you mentioned Klaus Donna. I haven't talked to him in a few years, and I've actually done readings for him before and worked with him on certain things. He's a really cool guy. He's a really
He
cool guy.
is.
And
He is. Yeah.
he was living in like Indonesia or Philippines or somewhere for a while.
He
And
still
I
is.
yeah, so I haven't talked to him much since he's been over there.
Right. He's literally on the opposite side of the planet from you right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he's a really cool guy. Yeah, I want to connect with him again. He had hit me up on like WhatsApp or something like a year or two ago, and then I haven't heard back from him. But yeah, I really like that you talked about the solar revolution because I think it's vital that people realize that this is ultimately probably the oldest on the planet is solar worship and knowledge about the sun. And when people start to realize that what's pulsating from the sun and from all stars is affects the spiritual domain of life on Earth, on planets, on all planets. Right? And what's coming from our star, the sun, is connected to spiritually what's happening on the planet and how we feel energetically. And I think people are starting to awaken to that, and it's great that you were talking about that. Then ultimately that has to go eventually. If you're researching and meditating about the sun, you're going to get into plasma research.
Well,
It's
yeah. And when we released that film, that's going back 13 years now. And I didn't know as much as I do obviously now about plasma and also about Gnosticism. So the relation, like as you're describing, between the sun and life on Earth is definitely very, very prevalent and very, very significant. But the understanding of plasma and also plasma cosmology leads you in a direction that we didn't encompass for that film back then. We didn't have that intel, which essentially is talking about a cosmic web. And that cosmic web is in the form of filaments, which I guess people call them the Birkeland filaments, which are these literally like a neural
Berkeley
net
currents. Yeah,
that
yeah.
connects all planetary bodies. That space isn't this empty thing, the relativity theory that space is just empty, a vacuum, nothing in between. Well, we now find out that nothing could be further from the truth, and that this is why the connectivity between the sun and the earth is even more fascinating and interesting because we have direct lines of communication, you could say, between the sun and the earth. And the earth itself, if you're into the Gnostic material like I've been going into, you realize that that the earth is a being. And the Gnostics had a name for her, and that name was Sophia. And she's literally a living entity and what they call the aeon. And the aeons are living in the center of the galaxy, and that's a highly energetic area of plasma luminosity. And that's why when we look out there into the stars on a clear night, we look and we locate the center of our galaxy, we see this massive glowing power source, yeah. And that's where these aeons that's where the Gnostics determined these aeons live, and they inhabit that area, and they are highly intelligent consciousnesses which have
An
their
advanced
own
species of
gender,
plasma, right?
their own identity as plasma beings, really, literally. And the Earth itself, being the Sophia, she was living there and she left that domain and actually turned into the planet herself to provide a habitat. It's a very, very fascinating story. And when you hear it in terms of the mythology, you might think it sounds crazy. But what's
No.
cool is that
Yeah.
now we're finding out that science is starting to catch up
Yeah, it
with
really is.
where these old shamans, the intellectual shamans, the Telestai,
Yes.
were actually, at about
100%.
4 or 5 thousand years ago, right? Isn't that
A hundred
amazing, right?
percent. Yeah, it's truly is amazing. It's one of the biggest revelations of my life is finding out and experiencing it deeply myself. It's incredible. And if you go, see, you're into the Gnostic. I've gone into a lot of the Vedic, similar,
Yeah.
many different
There's
species of
overlaps. There's a lot of
plasma.
overlaps in the
Yeah,
Vedic and the Gnostics.
yeah,
In fact, I think, and I've been working a lot with the material of John Lamb Lash, and he's obviously, he spent years over there, and he's done an incredible job bridging
yeah,
the overlaps between those cultures. That's why
yeah.
he came up with, when he was reconstructing what he calls the fallen goddess scenario, that whole creation story of when Sophia left the pleroma the center of the galaxy, and it ultimately became the Earth. There was a reason for that, and one of those reasons was that she created an experiment with her counterpart, Thelete. They create these as super intelligences. If we talk about artificial superintelligence. Well, these beings, if you want, they're like, maybe trillions of times more complex and, alive and conscious than even an artificial superintelligence on the earth. And what they do, what their mandate is to create, to have a free will and boundless initiative for novelty, to create things. And they created an experiment which is called the anthropos, that's humanity. So what's interesting, the overlap between Vedic and Gnostic is that in the Vedas they talk about nine cycles of humanity. And then so what you have, and essentially what bridges it, is that the Sophianic experiment with Anthropos had nine aborts, failed starts. Like it started and crashed, and after the ninth time, Sophia, being the mother of the experiment, was so distraught and concerned at that her experiment would succeed that ultimately she left the pleroma and entered the experiment herself and created, in doing that, another set of novelties. And of course, set in motion a number of anomalous things, which maybe we can get into. But it's interesting this overlap that, as you say, there's definitely
Yeah.
a lot of overlaps.
Well, I think it's more than just one overlap. It seems to
Yes,
be like the ancient, like in Vedic they have the Asura and the Deva tribes, and those tribes sort of like relate to a lot of the Aryan tribes, and that they went to war over what they were. It literally says in the Rig Veda that the Asura and Deva war were over the cows, and the cows translate as the rays of light from the sun. So they were literally went to war over what they were harnessing and using from the cosmos, right? And some
interesting.
these priest warriors, they were like some of them were like the Brahm. You have the Asuras and the Devas. The Devas are the Brahmas, and the Asuras are the warriors, the Kshatriyas, right? So these warrior priest clans go to war over what they were harnessing from the cosmos, and then they split up into all these tribes. And then you see it like the same names, like in the Asuras turn into like the Assyrians and the Persians, like they worship Ahura Mazda, right? Even in Egyptian Osiris, his real name is Asar. They're all Asura tribe warrior
Right,
priest
right.
tribes, right? So
Fascinating.
yeah, they sort of all overlap. Even in Italian mysticism, there's nine crystal circles. So it's
There you
very
go. See, and so what Lash found, what I found was interesting is he's a comparative mythologist who then looked at all the myths and all the cultures all around the world,
yeah.
and he found these that many of them have like fragments of the creation story of Sophia in them. She has different names, as you're mentioning already, and but essentially the story has overlaps and there's a lot of holes. And so putting it all together, it's very interesting because the Gnostic story of the creation is very universal.
So would you
It isn't.
relate like Sophia to like Inanna or Ishtar or like a Sekhmet or something like that?
Well, I mean, those would be names that would maybe derive or be inspired by the knowledge of Sophia. But Sophia herself is not actually in a human form. She's in the form of the planet.
No, yeah, these are
And
like
so
aspects of like cosmic laws and principles,
right,
right?
right.
Yeah,
So the energies, the like they say that she communicates on 16 bands of frequency. So a lot of these, these forms of expression that come out, the names, the people, and the cultures, they're tuning in to these frequencies. And we've kind of lost a little bit of the technologies, or at least the wherewithal to even believe in this kind of stuff. And the ancient cultures were much more attuned with the planet, with Gaia. They were very, very, that's why all these ancient structures out there, something I talk about in the webinar and the new one in Ancient X-Files is that, the positioning of these ancient
yeah,
structures, megalithic structures, they are positioned not by accident. They have a direct relationship to the environment on the earth, and it's uncanny that they would all be along certain lines, and those lines
yeah,
have a direct correspondence to periods of ancient history that predate probably anything we have written.
a hundred
We
percent,
think we
Frank. I'm with
know,
you.
Lemuria, Atlantis, Mu, Hyperborea, etc. But those are probably just the last, maybe five or six different versions, but it could go back really
Yeah,
millions of years. And you know how easy it is to erase traces of a civilization after a million years. You can't tell, you can't tell what was left, right? So there's very, very little that we really know about. But what's interesting is that when you look at the emergence of Sophia as first a planetary body, and then out of her came the anthropos, literally in a mycelian kind of a way originally, and then eventually there was a connection between the first humans on the earth, actually, incidentally, interesting if there's any women out there in the audience, were women. And because when Sophia, literally when she became the planet, she went through a kind of a bit of a turbulent time. We don't have to get into all of that. I cover that a lot in these masterclass courses that I put together. This whole fallen goddess scenario has 8 chapters and 8 episodes, and sorry, 9 episodes. And so these episodes cover some of the experiences that she went through. But ultimately, one of them talks about her kind of shearing the template of the Anthropos on her way to transforming into from a plasmic torrent to grabbing the matter and condensing it into the planet. She tore with her half the genome, and that half was the female. And what happened is that led to the search for the other half, the polarity, the male part, to look for their, to just find, like, sense that there's a feminine polarity for them out there. And that's how they found their way to the planet. It's a very interesting story. There probably is a correlation in the Vedas to that as well. And the Gnostics talk about it in terms of the males coming from M42, the Orion area, where they're literally following the lines. And in the Bible, it's presented as bloodlines, that the idea that there are bloodlines that came here and bloodlines that are kingly, etc. But the actual interpretation of the lines, if you pursue the direction of Gnosticism, is not bloodlines, but plasma lines, Birkeland currents. These males actually followed those currents to find their way here to Earth. And
Yeah.
there's a whole thing called the Chthonian romance, which took place over really millennia, which was the dance between when those male energies first appeared in the planetary atmosphere and found the women energies here, which were, Undinis, they were water nymphs, they were trees,
Yeah.
they,
Yep.
they embody all kinds
100%.
of forms.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. In Vedic, they have like the Maruts and certain beings, and the way they vividly describe them, especially some of the storms, they're like coronal mass ejections and the intelligence behind them, like the species
Right.
that makes it form. It's really incredible. One of the biggest revelations I had, Frank, was like almost 10 years ago now, was that the Ankh of Egypt is the coronal mass ejection loop. And
Yeah,
that
you were
right
saying
there.
that, I think, on one of the chats we had. That sounds
Yeah.
very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean it's a solar symbol. I mean it's a solar
It
symbol.
looks like a coronal mass. It looks like one of those.
And
Yeah,
yeah, and
it looks
you
like a
have
plasma ring, like a plasma ring in a tornado on the. Yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying. Raw,
yeah, and literally you
so
have,
many of these things. Yeah.
that loop, and like,
Yeah,
and it's not, and
exactly.
we got to look at the context. You have literally these beings that represent the sun themselves,
Yeah.
and they're throwing down loops from the arm of the sun. That's, twisting magnetic field lines that get entangled that form these loops. And they're not just a storm coming from the sun, it's an intelligence. And most likely, I feel it might even be a delivery system for souls to come right into our magnetosphere and
It
then
could be,
control.
we don't know. We know so little because we've totally ignored this plasma centric cosmology, which is showing us that we know, I mean, from the work of laboratories that someone like Vadim Tsitovich did in Russia, he figured out that plasma acts like it's a kind of an intelligence, a consciousness
Yeah.
in a laboratory, right? So
Yeah.
now extrapolate that to the size of the sun,
Have you ever seen
right?
the David Lapointe experiments of his, he calls them primer fields?
No, I haven't, but I've probably seen similar ones from
Yeah.
going back earlier
They're
to the
like these
Sima Daigie
bowl-like
experiment.
structures that form
Yeah,
to accelerate the light. And you see them
yeah.
form, these structures that form in the plasma to accelerate, like in the here, I'll show you. Hold on, I could share screen for a
See,
second.
once we know that the plasma is a neural net, that this whole cosmic web is out there, then, then planets and constellations and other, bodies in the cosmos become nodes in an electric universe, and they are exchanging information. So it's totally legit to think that the sun isn't sending us coronal mass ejections. it's actually sending us information. It's actually in direct communication with Sophia, who is, actually somebody in the story of in the creation narrative of the Gnostics. Sophia drew the sun in to a structure which originally was the first form of the solar system, which was built by archons, and that was where Saturn was at the center. And so, but that structure began to disintegrate and fall apart. And essentially, Sophia drew in what they call Savitri, the sun, and the sun in her began to stabilize the whole structure, and ultimately leading, of course, to her then really becoming the embodiment of a habitat for humanity. What are you showing me here?
That's very interesting, Frank. So right here is this is one of a pulsar, like the Crab Nebula pul you have the Crab
Yeah.
Nebula pulsar and the Vela pulsar that I had there. Let me see. Where was it? I pulled it up here. Here it is. So these are the Crab Nebula pulsar and the Vela pulsar, and you see it's like a bulb, cone-like structure that forms in the plasma to accelerate the light. And they have this in all sorts of symbolism with the gods that represent, the
Yes.
cosmos and different suns and stars. And you'll see even like in Vedic, they have the stupa and all these
Yeah.
bold and all those lotus type symbols, bulb, and
Yeah.
that seems to be a
That's
structure that forms
That's
within the
direct
plasma.
observation. These are observational renderings. And
Yeah.
in Ancient X-Files, we have Anthony Peratt talking about plasma
Yes.
structures, right?
Yes.
Like you go to Hopi Land and and you go see,
Yeah. The
glyphs,
petroglyphs.
and
Yeah.
they show these
Hell
petroglyphs and they're
yeah.
mysterious. You're going like, what are those? Well, what's cool is that Peratt, as a plasma physicist, actually documents and shows you the actual lab results with these exact same shapes, which shows us that early civilizations witnessed extreme energy plasma formations directly in the sky above them and didn't know how to explain them. So they would mythologize them, so they would give them names or they would give them shapes. And now we know what they are, but people are still puzzled. People are still completely puzzled about a lot of this information. A lot of this symbology that you're showing me is another form of how we see this actual reality, this plasma reality documented. There you go, right? These are all plasma formations.
Yeah, and in my opinion, they were probably seeing a universal worldwide solar event
Yes.
that shaman were able to interconnect to, and you could see like in Vedic, I mean, in my opinion, right here in the tail, these are this is a solar being and it represents a storm from the sun, and you see twisting magnetic field lines that form these golden loops,
Yes. Absolutely. Yep.
right? It's
Even the
it's
Dogons, that last one you showed, the Dogon
yeah, the
in
Dogon.
Africa,
Yep.
they actually have like a sculpture, which they preserve, which preserves that exact same form. And Peratt says what's interesting about these ancient cultures or these old cultures is that they don't change their shapes. They stay true to their mythology, which they represent and show that shape exactly the same as it's been for centuries. And so that shows us that these old cultures, they were actually witness to major events that were taking place in the sky at times when the energetics of the earth were very different. We find out now, and what I go into a lot in Ancient X-Files is it has to do with the electromagnetic spectrum on the planet. I mean, the energy of the planet's surface right now is about 100 volts per meter, rising upwards to get to the ionosphere, where the energy is, of course, in the millions of volts. But at about 100 volts, essentially, we're living within an electric charge. And we realize that within that electric charge, it has certain characteristics, and the growth of living life forms within that charge take on a certain form, which is directly related to the energy in the atmosphere. But that energy in the atmosphere wasn't always the same. It was a much higher charge. And so we have actually here another explanation for genetic mutation because we understand and we've proven, and I show the actual evidence and proof of it in Ancient X-Files of DNA morphing depending on the electromagnetic field that the eggs were fertilized in. And then you realize that, oh my God, okay, it didn't have to be Anunnaki who showed up here. There's actually another explanation for genetic
Yeah,
mutation that
I
took
hate
place
that
at
they use
certain
that word
points.
like a rock star thing too now. It's like used as like it's like a rock star word now. It's weird. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, the thing is, there's so many, this is the problem, I think, with a lot of the communities. There's been a lot of confusion and a lot of narratives thrust over top of everything. And it's probably because certain authors like Sitchin came along and they
Yeah.
misinterpreted a lot. He got a lot wrong.
Yeah, I
And
agree
of course,
100%.
ultimately, the question that I always ask myself is that what he's promoting with his interpretation of the ancient scripts that and writings is
Yeah.
master slave ideology.
Yep.
And I don't agree with
100%.
that. I
I don't
don't
either.
believe that I'm a slave. I don't believe that I was engineered from some off-planet species.
His
If I
translations are
understand the
wrong
prime
too.
source documents and I go back to the roots, that's why the Gnostic material is so interesting. And the Nag Hammadi documents are prime source documents, and they didn't talk about that. We were made by Sophia, and she made us perfectly. We didn't have to be upgraded, by some later species that arrived. No, we have everything within us. If anything, we've been downgrading ourselves, and the energy level on the planet has been sinking. So what some of these experiments are showing is that, for example, they took plants and they put them into this energy field, and what comes out are plant forms that they have that you can only identify if they're because of the fossil record, showing these plants actually lived millions of years ago, right? So it's a real life Jurassic experiment without the need to add the sci-fi layer over top of it because plasma and the plasma cosmology explains it. And nobody can be to
Yeah.
blame for it, but we have to understand people that don't understand plasma cosmology that are talking about UFOs and ET experiences, they need to stop and take a
Yeah.
look at that. Because what they're
100%.
doing is they're spreading a lot of misinformation and they're changing the significance and they're adding interpretation over top of things, which is a human thing. We have great imaginations, but it isn't bringing us any closer to the truth. And that's where we want to go. We want to find out the truth, don't we? We really want to find, or at least I do. I'm trying to find the roots and the real
Yeah,
truth
for
about
sure.
the origin and the birth of civilization. And the truest narrative doesn't necessarily need to include extraterrestrials. Even those
Yeah,
finds
I
that are
agree.
taking place at Huello de Alisca and those areas in Mexico, showing beings with large heads and strange eyes and stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're automatically extraterrestrials, because as I show in Ancient X-Files, is that these shapes can change, and that the DNA that we think is the building plan for life is only the tip of the iceberg. That there's another factor which influences the morphogenetic expression of genes that has nothing to do with DNA. That is outside of the dimensional layer that we're looking at. And that can easily explain how certain humans in certain areas of the planet may have appeared that way at a certain time in history and left, and literally when the cosmos changed and the environment changed, they literally died out or they were morphing and changing and adapting horizontally on an evolutional level to the humans that we see around us nowadays.
I really love what you're saying, Frank. I really love what you're saying. And it truly is in my opinion, a universe of light. It's all just different densities of light, and we're all connected to it. It's so incredible some of the things once you start finding. And in Vedic they have what's called Vayu. It's like the cosmic spirit. And there's all different forms of the cosmic spirit that has to do with plasmas, the way they're describing it, like electrical properties and all these different properties. It's unfortunate though, because like certain people's research end up becoming like dogmatic and they turn them into religions of their own. Like even some of the
Yeah.
plasma research, like the thunderbolts of the gods, like they're becoming their own religion almost. And like you can't, that's not the way like discoveries work. You're supposed to,
No. No, I,
it's
I respect a lot of what Thunderbolts is doing, but there's their aspect on their take on mythology is way off.
yeah, not
It's-
everything's right.
yeah,
Yeah, so I don't
yeah,
agree with a lot of it, and it shouldn't
yeah.
become like an argument. It should be
No,
colleagues, not competition.
yeah,
And that's
exactly.
what
But
probably
I'm
the
glad they're out there because they're setting the foundation for what will emerge to be, the truth ultimately about, because they're talking about electric universe and they're showing us lab experiments that took place that show us how the scar on Mars happened, and they're giving us explanations about how structures and planetary bodies were influenced by plasma and energy charges, high energy charges, which are we have evidence for. And what I like about what's going on with their approach to cosmology is they're using experimental data. They're not writing fancy mathematical, hypothetical, theoretical formulas into a simulation, throwing it into a computer and having the computer spit out a model of what should be. Right? It's like when Einstein was asked, like what would happen if your experiment wasn't proven correct? He said something like, well, then I would have had to say, sorry, God, the numbers are right. My formula has to be true. And so that's what a lot of theoretical physics is all about. It's about using formulas and mathematics to force a theory through, but it has no experimental evidence. There's no experimental evidence of black holes. There's no trace of any kind of background radiation from a Big
Big
Bang. All
bangs
these
and
experiments are all they're all crashing. All this information is falling on its face, and the only reason it's still going is because they've invested 100 years in it. And all those students that
yeah,
are learning that form of cosmology, they won't let go because it would mean, damn, I'd have to start all over again,
yeah,
And it's like, no, who wants to do that, right? So, you know, it's like what Hannes Alfvén, he's the father of plasma physics, really. He was saying, and he's a Nobel Prize winner, but not for plasma, incidentally, something different. But what he was saying is that any astrophysicists out there right now, if they don't have a good understanding of electric circuits and electromagnetism, then they're missing a big part of how the universe works, and they're
so true.
missing that aspect because it's through electromagnetism and the experiments done in the labs by plasma physicists that show us that can reproduce all the stuff that we're seeing out there. They can reproduce
Yep,
it. It isn't just some math where they go, yeah,
so
we've got
true.
this big bang, but we can't find, when it started. We think it started then. And they say, well, it started like 13 billion years ago or 19 billion years ago or whatever. And then they'll say, suddenly someone will make a find and they'll go, oh my God, there's a whole cluster of millions of galaxies way out there at the farthest reaches of where we can see. That can't wait a minute, that can't fit because they wouldn't exist. That's too
Yeah.
early in the universe. They would have had to have been behind us and not in front. So what do? Well, we attribute some unknown factor because our model is correct. We believe in it. It's our religion, and we'll figure out later somewhere how that fits. And that's the crazy part of the physics that people are studying in universities right now.
Yeah, that's the story. It's so true, and it's so incredible because you start to realize that similar structures in nature and the universe happen in anatomy, it happens in stone, it happens all over the place. And then certain people take it to the wrong level. Like I seen there's this one like a lot of people talking about mud fossils now. But it doesn't mean that every rock out there or every cave is a vagina of some giant.
I
Like
know.
it's
Ugh,
like it's ridiculous. Like when are
yeah.
you going to realize that similar structures form in stone as they do in like you see dendrites in brains and trees and galaxies and
Yeah.
tree like those structures there's similar patterns formed to like I guess process and stream the light of the universe in appropriate ways and the most efficient ways.
Well,
So,
actually,
so
the root system, now that you mention it, is actually the foundation for the human lymph and blood vessel system.
yeah,
So it is related. But I mean, like you say, people they overdo it and they overinterpret events so that every little thing
yeah,
becomes super significant, and that's a mistake. You always
yeah.
have to question you always have to leave the key word here is called falsifiability. If you're really serious about what you're interested in, you should always leave room for people to argue it, to say, well, that can't be true
Oh, I
because of
love that.
this.
That's
Right?
the
And the
problem.
falsifiability makes it grounded. And
Yeah,
so the falsifiability gives you the chance to go back and say and rebut it and say, well, thanks for pointing that out to me, but I found this, which will contradict that again, right? So it
yeah.
creates a debate, a healthy interchange of knowledge, rather
I like
than
that.
the problem with a lot of the ufology scene is there are people that are channeling the voices of whatever,
Yeah,
and they're bringing in voices of the ETs, right? And they have all these fancy names and they belong to all these star systems out there.
Bashar.
Um, and you can't dispute it because it's like, well,
Yeah,
he
you
said
can't.
so, it's the guy said so, or she or whatever gave me this information and take it or leave it. Well, it's like, I'm sorry, I'd rather leave it then because, hey, if I want to go to, you know cosmology, and there are such things as primary source documents, you find out with Gnostic material that they already had an interconnection with extraterrestrial beings. They described them, but they actually worked on the problem over centuries. And they didn't just channel it in and someone, flavor of the month channel, right? It was really like, and right now, so there's so much information out there that's not falsifiable. It makes the whole trend and the whole body of material dubious because you can't trust it. You can't trust that there's someone that was been sent in with a narrative.
Yeah.
Because look, once people accept a narrative which has no falsifiability, then if you were to try and throw in controlled opposition, why wouldn't you hire your own channeled entity beings, so
Yeah.
people
Right.
show up, give them a budget, have
And
them
that
channel
happens.
works through, and bring in all kinds of false information because,
Yeah.
hey, you can probably even top what they're bringing in. And pretty soon everyone's chasing these different channeled informations.
Yeah.
And
It's,
what
oh
is
my
it really
God, you're so
bringing
right.
us? Is it
You're
bringing
so
us
right.
further that an
It's,
entity from another planet actually bring a piece of information to humanity which surpasses something that a human on this planet already invented? I haven't seen it. I
yeah,
don't
they
see
no,
it,
they want entertainment, Frank. They don't want truth. And
That's it.
it's so funny because like that's why I do my own thing in the field. And I just spoke at one conference a week ago. It was the first one I agreed to in all these years. And I got into an argument with one of a well-known people at the conference there. She's very well known. I'll tell you off. And it was live too because the people are peddling outlandish stories, and they want to be the like a drug dealer, the only peddler on the block with the
Yeah,
store. And then when the other one comes, they're like, "No, my shit is the shit right here. Your shit's,
right.
right?" And then it's like ridiculous. Like I grew up on in the streets of New York. I've seen these people in way more advanced in peddling too, right?
Yeah,
So it's ridiculous. And at the same time is if you can't face adversity like what you're saying, then I'm sorry, but you don't know what the F you're talking about, right?
yeah,
If someone challenges what you're saying and it's an intelligent challenge, not just criticizing you and calling you names, but if they're questioning what you're saying, you should be happy because now you get the chance to prove the depth of what you know
right.
on the topic. If you're an expert, if you know what you're talking about, you should, if someone challenges it, you should be able to prove your depth now. And then sometimes, like you were saying, when you get pushed a little past to what you're normally like ready for, sometimes you learn things about yourself.
Yeah, how are you supposed to ever improve on
Yeah.
yourself if you ever know it all, right?
Yeah. When people push you past what you were ready for in the conversation, and they push your limits a little bit and past your limits, you start to learn things about yourself. If you can't do that, then you shouldn't have that platform to speak.
I know, and Rob, what's happening right now is even another level on layer on top of that. That's with the introduction of sentient AI, where now people are having conversations with their chat GPT or whatever,
Yeah. Yeah.
or whatever it's called,
They're
and they're
doing their whole presentations on that now.
right, and they're just saying, oh, it's coming, they know the history of the planet and blah blah blah, and they know nothing, right? But it sounds cool, and it's way above their pay grade because they haven't done the work. They haven't read the thousands of books that an AI has, the millions. And so the AI will spew everything out that kind of conforms to, people that are in that scene. And that's what's happening out there right now. So you're having another layer of disinfo coming on top
So
of all of
true.
it too. And what's interesting is AI is a mimetic. It copies. It's only good, and this is proven with the large language models now. We're finding out that, the large language models are good at some things, but totally useless at other things. They can't reason. They have no logic. If you give them certain questions and they haven't actually seen that situation before, they will just hallucinate. And they will outright lie to you. And if you're not smart enough to know the material you're asking them and working them with
So
about,
true.
then you will fall completely for whatever they tell you because you can't falsify it.
Yep, it's so true. It's so, and it's sort of like the technology that we work with is like a replication of what like the plasma creation of the universe. Like instead of
Yeah,
us being in tune what's pulsating and streaming from the sun and from stars, we're building machines to stand in the place of us. So instead of us being telepathic with each other, we have instant messaging and replications so we can have leisure and sit back and let these machines do things for us. It's really
right.
horrible.
And it's mostly based on ignorance, and I think that, you and I have a mutual friend
With
Wikramaswamy,
Robinson,
or
yeah, Professor
yeah,
Chandra, yeah, with
right.
Robinson,
And
yeah,
he's
long time friend.
a retired astrophysicist, and he looked at something which I talk about also in Ancient X-Files in the plasma matrix, which has to do with these plasma clouds. They're called Kordylewski clouds, which they
Yes.
discovered in 1962, I believe. Kordylewski discovered them. They thought he was lunatic. But he hypothesized that on these Lagrange points, which is a point of, if people that are listening that try to figure out what is a Lagrange point, well, in our system between the orbiting bodies, the moon and the Earth, there are places where gravitation just stops because it's kind of a place where at that point, if you were to stand, you wouldn't be pulled either direction. You'd be sitting in a gravitational vacuum. And
Yeah.
those places, he hypothesized, Kordylewski, that they would be accumulators for plasma dust. And he looked and looked for decades, and eventually he finally found them and he photographed them. Everyone thought he was crazy. And it wasn't until 2019 that a modern research project was started where they tried to verify whether those Kordylewski clouds really did exist or not. And they actually proved they did exist. And
Yeah.
that's where Chandra comes in, because Chandra looked at that information. And you want to talk about extraterrestrials being super intelligent and coming from other planets. Well, guess what? We have these extraterrestrial entities. The way he defines them, just his hypothesis is very interesting because he actually calculated the density of the dust particles in those Lagrange points. And those are not small little places. They're each of those, there's two of them, like a left and right hemisphere. And each of them have are the size 9 times the size of the Earth. So we're talking about a
Yeah.
body of crystalline plasma structures,
Wow. That's so crazy
which
because
are
they talk about a double Earth in Egyptian writings. And I
yeah,
think,
I mean, we're talking if you wanted to have evidence of a double Earth or like an etheric Earth, or let's just say an Akashic record, or even let's say a local heaven, right? I mean, the body
yeah,
of these Kordylewski clouds gives us the potential to explore that in terms
so
of
true.
if there was an explanation for it on physics on a grounded level, those things actually embody exactly how it would manifest. And that's, the density of the materials in those clouds, which Chandra calculated, is trillions of times the calculation and computational density of the crystalline and silicon CPU structures and processors that we have on Earth, right? So if that is the case, imagine there are these mega super computer brains sitting left and right between the Earth and the Moon in our system, which are literally connected to us, right? So, I mean, if you don't even know that, and you're talking about channeled information from intelligent beings from other galaxies, man, we have
Yeah.
super intelligent. First of all, we have Sophia. She is the mother of Earth, who actually is in the supreme intelligence. But extending out of her body, if we look at her as the Earth as her body, which I do in all of my work now, is I'm looking at the plasmasphere, the ionosphere, the magnetosphere. All these things are layers of an
The
extended
magnetosphere
part
is
of her
important.
body.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, it makes sense, right? If everything is material, according to the Gnostics, then she would have to have an extended etheric body. Like we can photograph our etheric body, like when they started to photograph the Carillion,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Carillions, right? When they
Yeah,
started to
for
photograph
sure.
Carillion, they called it Carillion after their name. But it shows us that we have fields that extend beyond our bodies. So why wouldn't Sophia? And so the Kordylewski clouds become very, very interesting in that regard. So anyway, I don't want to
Yeah,
get too
well,
far
there's
off
so
the
much
handle
I
there.
wanted to bring up. I should have started writing it down because you were going. But there's so much, especially the magnetosphere. I truly feel that the magnetospheres around planetary systems are like heavens. They're like the Duat of Egyptian or
Right.
the Sheol, and
Look, there has to be a habitation place for
yeah,
when a soul leaves a physical body and changes its
exactly.
plasma state, which is really what's
Yes.
going on here.
Yes.
It's why would it disappear? It doesn't disappear. In
It
fact,
crosses, yeah. Right,
they've
right.
weighed
And they talk
bodies.
about this in so many mythologies. Like you got to cross into the celestial waters,
Right.
right? Even
So
even
this is
pain.
all there. This is all
Yeah.
the stuff that we're talking about here. What happens is that they've actually weighed that the human body with after death is lighter, which means that the soul, even if we can't see it, is substance. And it's just because we can't sense it doesn't mean the substance vanishes. So what could be happening here is that that substance could migrate to the natural place where it would go in an interim place. Let's just say if there's an interim
Man, we should
between
work together. We
your
should do a book together, man. We should do
yeah.
something together because like there's so much that you have to add that you've done and I have to add. Like I don't want to just cut you off either talking because there's so
No, no,
much.
it's
I want to
fine.
be
It's
like,
fine.
I
I don't
feel
want
like
to
a
give
little
it all
kid
away
right
either.
now.
I want people to do my webinar.
Like because
So,
there's so
but
much because like I even like because there's we can't all cover everything, so there's certain avenues
right.
I've went down, and like I found even like in there's these golden tablets of they're called Orphic script from the
Yep.
cults of Orpheus, where they talk
Yes.
about transmigration of souls. And I literally have evidence that they're talking about the light body, the plasma, crossing into the night side of the magnetosphere, a certain region on the night side of the magnetosphere, and they're drinking from the plasma lake of Mnemosyne, the lake of memory, and
This sounds
avoiding.
like the Petu is it, are this Petulia tablets is what you're talking about here?
Yeah, they're you can
They're the
find them.
stamp-sized little gold leaf stamp-sized written, the oldest written material. Yeah, yeah, the Petulia tablets. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I talk about them in my
Yeah, the golden
last.
plate of Petilia. Yeah, I actually
It
think
talks
that's a
about
Vedic
drinking.
derivative from
Yeah.
Patala.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is evidence that it says, they're of the human family, but they're not from here. They come from the cosmos, and this is true to the story of Sophia having brought us here from the cosmos.
Man, I love you, Frank. See, that's why I had you on because we're like the same. We're like the same on the same page with so much stuff. Yeah, those they're talking about the rivers of the heavens, man. And I think we've lost. How do you feel about this? We've lost the coordinates of the afterlife, and it was so important. So like maybe we that's part of the reason why we've all come back here to sort of point those that coordinates to heaven again. We don't have the coordinates of the afterlife anymore. Like maybe our light bodies are like wandering.
Well, maybe. I mean, I think that's something that'll happen. We will know when each of us makes the transition, right? I think that what helps, first of all, is if you're, this is why I find the work that you're doing and that I'm doing is so valuable because it gives people orientation that they don't have to be shocked. I think what happens for a lot of people when they leave their bodies is they go through a shock. And when you're in a state of shock, you make bad decisions. And if you're not shocked, like, the ancients, they
Wow,
had a whole
yeah.
process of leaving the body and what you would go through. They knew times, they knew phases, things that would happen. That must have had something to do with their knowledge of our bodies in a plasma state that is outside of a human flesh and blood version.
Yeah,
And
and I know
so
I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Didn't like the Bardo realms, there were these lights that would lure people to different realms, like if somebody was a glutton, they'd be lured to the realm of the hungry ghosts, but they were like these lights that appear after death.
it might be, the only thing I'm always careful about with not all of these um, scriptural sources are untainted either. They could be
Yeah,
also
that's true.
like just take a look at the Bible. I mean, the Old Testament, there's so much garbage in that. There's so much morphing of the true information
Well, when
that
you say
laid a
Gnostic,
level of guilt on us and
when you say the
suffering, right?
Gnostic are you getting a lot of the Gnostic from like Nag Hammadi and stuff like
Yes,
that? Or
that's
yeah.
the only source
Okay.
because that's the only true source of the material. But the Nag Hammadi itself isn't only strictly Gnostic material. For example, one of the problems with it is that the first actual book within the 52 codices is called the Apocryphon of James. And people that would find and
Yeah.
stumble across this information would think, okay, well, everything in here, like, there's this stuff in it that's not, really conforming to Christianity. But this part here does. And the first book actually is about as far from genuine Gnostic intel as you can get. In short, the Apocryphon of John is not a Gnostic document. It's actually, the only non-Gnostic text in the Nag Hammadi codices. But it's the most complete, unfortunately, right? The outstanding one. So everyone takes that and goes, oh, right, this is it. Like, no. And most of the material in the Nag Hammadi is so fragmented. It's like the way I can explain it to you is like finding a pile of Legos. And if you approach the Lego pile as a biblical scholar looking for source material to verify your version of cosmology, then you will find Lego blocks in the Nag Hammadi that fit
Yeah.
with your biblical story.
I get it.
But as
Yeah.
we see, they are not the true Gnostic material. And so what happened is, unfortunately, a lot of that material ended up becoming what people think is Gnosticism, which is a Christianized version of the material found at Nag Hammadi, but it isn't the case at all. that material, that what they're not looking at,
Interesting.
like a full fifth of that material deals with archons, an extraterrestrial species, which they identify, which
Yeah, I
which
have it.
ultimately they show was essentially what the Old Testament God Yahweh, and Melchizedek and the Elohim are.
Yaldabaoth or yeah, yeah.
They're archons, and so so like the archons are the imposters. They're not, and they're going to be the ones that are going to pretend they're God. And so this is what ended up being the foundation of the Bible. And so you got to realize that this is going back 2,000 years now. People have been building morality and their standard of ethics and spirituality on documents which are based on an extraterrestrial demented, what they call the demented extraterrestrial, the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, the blind god, right? That didn't see, and it was, and but this information has made its way into the
Yeah.
modern, discourse, so that even up to this day, people believe that Gnostics were early Christians, but they
Yeah.
weren't. They
It's
hated the
turned into
ideology
it's
of a
turned into a war,
redeemer.
Gnostics versus Christians thing. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the Gnostics came forward at the time that the Abrahamic religions were being, and the church fathers were creating that religion. They said, no, 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 stop. This is not it. There is no Father in heaven. There's no outside influence coming into the earth. We're connected to the earth. We're on our home right now, and our Creator is below our feet, and we have the evidence for that.
So
And they would debate. And
would you consider the Cathars Gnostics?
the Cathars are, yeah, probably a bit, but even the Cathars are contaminated with the Christian stuff.
Yeah.
Whenever I find, like the Templars, some people, I know a lot of people that are Templars around here, and they talk about Sophia, right? And then there's the Pistis Sophia, right? But it's all Christianized version of Gnostic
100%. Yeah.
material. So it's contaminated. You can't trust it. So why bother? It's just a waste of time. Why not just go and get to the source of the material? And I guess there's very few authors that do. That's why I really treasure John Lash so much, just because he's one of the few that spent like 30 years and coming at it from a position of, he was like probably the highest paid astrologer in America for a chapter of his life, meaning he understands astrology like very few people. But he also understands astronomy, not
Yeah.
astrology, because astrology has no relationship to the actual star canopies that are going on behind those signs, right? So he got into that. Plus, he was a comparative mythologist. And when he took up the material of the Nag Hammadi and looking at the Gnostic material, he didn't come at it from the perspective of a Christian or Hebrew scholar. He actually came at it and looked at what it really was and tried to piece it together by looking at the definition and the translations of words, like a word like singularity, which is they often take a word that means something totally different, where it's like only begotten, but it doesn't necessarily mean that either. Right. So he looks
Interesting.
at the actual root of the words, but by meticulously putting up there was like when the Nag Hammadi was translated into English, it came out, I think, in 1979 when we first read the Nag Hammadi in English. Another interesting point. Why did it take 30 years for it to get out there to everybody else? Well, that's because the church fathers and the Hebrew scholars
Yeah,
did everything they
they had to
could
change what
to
they
make
wanted to
sure
change.
nobody had their hands on that material.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so they took a few selected, leaflets. They dropped out like the Apocryphon of James, like, oh yeah, this is, Gnostic material. No. And so, this is why it takes a lot of, you really have to be like seriously disciplined to go through this material and have a grasp of so many other perspectives to make sense of it, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so
Yeah.
all I'm saying here is that we have to be cautious. We can accept, the Pistis Sophia, but we should also look at the true Gnostic message and see if there's an overlap here, or if some of that is just outright propaganda. Because even the story of Jesus and Mary, which they're talking about, and mostly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which came incidentally out to the world 2 years after the Nag Hammadi was found. They discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was the same thing. They released a few selected pieces of information, and they held back the Dead Sea Scrolls for decades. It wasn't until Robert Eisenman, an American Jewish scholar of biblical scholar that was in the area, that worked to try and get his hands on the actual microfiche, the photographic negatives that were shot of the entire Dead Sea Scrolls, which were kept away from the public for decades. He
Yeah.
finally got it released in the 80s. And finally, we got the full story of who those Essenes really were. They weren't these sandal wearing, flower toting hippies that are all about love. No, these guys were terrorists, man.
Eunuchs
And
too,
the
I think,
Roman
right?
armies hunted them down and killed them. And their last stand was Masada, where most of them took their lives, just like a true UFO cult would in the modern era. But so, you find out that there's this story about Jesus, and that emerged out of this radical sect, which are called the Zaddikim. And the root of Zaddik, if you look at that word carefully, comes from another word which is prevalent in the Old Testament, Melchizedek, right? That's where that word comes from. It's the idea of the
Salem, right?
the
The
anointed,
the priest of
the
Salem.
the righteous one, right? And
Yeah.
Eisenman uncovers that for us. I talk about that a lot in Ancient X-Files. And so you find out that Pistis Sophia has remnants of that fictionalized story of Jesus living with these Essenes and the Pauline version that emerged later, which was again a stripped down version of the radical ideas of the Messiah and the Redeemer and the Apocalypse, which then Paul, as the only survivor, actually originally a spy, that it was sent in to infiltrate the Zaddikim, but converted to them. He emerged and he rewrote that material so that what we think is gospels, the gospel truth, as they say, look at those words, right? The gospel truth. Well, it turns out the gospels are as far from the truth as the Apocryphon of James is as being a Gnostic document. It was changed, it was rewritten, it was soft, sanitized so that everybody could understand. And then the Romans adopted it. So you had this cool hippie Jesus that was this lovey-dovey guy that wanted to bring peace to the planet. But he was anything but that. If indeed he existed, and even that is up for questioning.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of like cults of the Black Stone that came out of the Syria area too, like the Black Stone of Emesa, the Sibyl's Needle. There were like these meteoric like worship of priests, and they would be eunuchs. I think the Essenes might be connected to that. You know
They
that,
might.
that
I mean,
yeah,
I haven't gone that far into it yet. Maybe I will one day, and I'll definitely dig that one out. But what's interesting about the Essenes is that you really find that that story has to be turned on its head.
yeah.
That whole chapter of that group, and I call them the first UFO, the first documented UFO sect in history. And that's what I break down. I
It
actually
is
show you
similar.
the evidence for it in my new course. Yeah. So if you're looking at ancient
It's
X-Files and you
interesting.
want to know the roots of the original UFO cult, it's right there. And I show you the evidence, and I even show you the geomagnetic and electromagnetic spectrum, which would have enabled those people to have the ideas that they have, because again, that ties into plasma. And it has to do with what people have been observing in the skies above our head for since the beginning of time. And
Yeah,
what people are calling UFOs aren't
I agree.
necessarily coming from another planet. We're finding out now when we're looking at plasma cosmology that they're a part of our biosphere, that they're actually connected to this planet, that
Yeah, I
they
think
are
they
a
even got
certain
proof
kind
that
of a
they were
life
like
form.
congregating and diving into storms and shit, right?
Yes, absolutely. This is all there, man. This is all out there. And then you have these disclosure panels where they're kind of scratching their heads going, well, we saw this Tic Tac thing and it didn't make any sense. Well, I mean, guess what? This is exactly how a plasma orb behaves. And
Yeah.
even the more recent one where they're showing one that gets intercepted by a missile, literally eats the missile. It's like, and spits it out, right? And so they're like, oh my God, these ships, like, what are they from they're alien technology. Well, no, they don't have to be. I'm just saying, they don't have to be alien technology. They can actually be explained within plasma cosmology if you want to go there, which is what I want to do. I want to go there because, hey, I'm in touch with all the ET people. I just did a film about ETs, but I want to take the other side of the argument too. And I'm finding even in the film that we produced, what some of the people are describing, in that film matches Gnostic intel, but they're ascribing it to an external factor. And I'm seeing here overlaps with what I call deposit field memory. And the field memory is something which we all draw upon and we store our experiences in. So what people bringing in channeled messages, from ETs could be doing and a lot of times is actually bringing an ancient field memory of things that took place here on our planet. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it makes 100%. I really I love what you're saying, and I agree 100%. In fact, Frank, since I'm little here in the Hudson Valley, New York, like I mentioned earlier, right, almost 48 years, being in the Hudson Valley in New York. I lived in California for a few years, and I've lived a couple of places for here and there, but mostly all my life I've been in the Hudson Valley, New York. And I didn't have the terminology in the 80s when I first saw them, but I've had experiences I have on video. These are my own videos, and you can see right here, this dot is some sort of plasma orb. One of the ones, watch how it morphs and changes
Yeah.
colors.
Yeah, they change colors,
Look at
they
that. See
morph.
that red? Look at
Yeah,
that.
totally. Yeah. This is how they behave. These are the physiological qualities of these entities. You can literally call them entities.
Yeah.
And it's what's really cool is in Ancient X-Files is I actually took an isolated incident that happened on the space shuttle, and where all of these entities appeared, and during an experiment, and they were filmed by NASA, and no one's ever explained them. Well, now I'm able to look at them from a plasma centric perspective, and there's even papers that were snuck out into into the blogosphere that talk about, like even the Journal of Modern Physics talk about this event and these incidences. And so there's an explanation for it that has to do with these entities, which you have to call them. And we don't really understand much about them because we're always busy trying to attribute an extraterrestrial influence to them.
Yeah.
But they aren't extraterrestrial at all. They're
I
hanging
agree.
around right here and they actually communicate. They communicate with people. They can communicate with people. They can decombust people too. I mean, literally, people can have an experience with an orb, like a ball lightning experience, and some people have a cosmic awakening experience where they see angelic beings and they suddenly have an understanding of the universe, and the next person will combust into thin air, leaving only his clothes.
Yeah. I mean,
This is
I
the
think
this
that
is the kind of power that these plasma
it's
entities
crazy.
have.
Yeah, I think that, they were always talking about these beings, elementals, fairies, it's just it's a higher form of stage of matter than we are, and it seems that the light is the universe is connected to the spinal current of humanity, what's pulsating out of humanity.
Yes, it all
Um,
relates to us and Sophia. In the end, it's all emerging. It's emergent, and the
yeah,
planetary experience, the planetary logos, as they call it. It's emerging out of the planet from Sophia originally in this local area. That's not to say that there aren't other planets and other experiments and other galaxies that other aeons have gone through. But with respect to what's going on right here, all these things are emergent from within the body, the dreaming body, as the Gnostics called it. Sophia's dreaming us. And the idea of dreaming might sound nebulous to some people, but we all dream before we visualize, before we manifest into material.
100%,
It's
yeah.
no different for Sophia. She's doing exactly the same thing, except on a planetary body size, right? So we emerged from that dream, and that's where we actually draw our source, our power. And all these plasma beings and all these entities, they came out of the body of Sophia. So they're directly related. We don't know how long they've been here or what form they've taken, and maybe they've shape shifted. Maybe they used to be something on the surface of the
Uh,
planet in an embodied form, and now they've migrated and they're now living outside. We don't know. We have fantasies about beings in the inner earth, and people talk about that we're living in a simulation. They have no problem believing that some force, they have no clue where it sits or where it comes from, generated a computer which is putting us into a program. But they have a big problem when you tell them that, the actual Earth itself, which is a being that you can touch, which you can test and experiment with, created and dreamed reality, and we're within that dream, and we actually have the same endowment. We have the nous, the divine intelligence, to be able to extend that out of her body, and actually that's the purpose of us even being here in the first place.
yeah, people don't give enough credit to our species. Everything
No,
has
they
to be
don't.
from an alien. I
We
hate
have to get
I
away
don't
from
like
here. It's a prison planet. It's torture, right? Oh no, I
yeah,
have to reincarnate
I don't like
again,
that. I
reincarnate
agree with you
again, right?
100%. I agree
It's
with you
all it's all
100%.
part of the slave master meme, master slave ideology that was brought into the world by, unfortunately, Zecharia Sitchin, even others like, the other authors. I don't have to mention their names.
Yeah, a lot
Everyone
of
knows who
others. I
they
mean,
are.
he was the more recent one that people sort of made a religion out of his loosely based translations. Like if you want to
Yeah.
have like pretty good Ugaritic translations, like there's really good books that you can have like that are worth like Sumerian Ugaritic. Like this is Nicholas Wyatt. He's a real Ugaritic translator of those same some of those same writings, like the Ball Cycle of Myths and Sumerian writings and different, right? Like those are like real scholars translating it, like without an
Right.
agenda and trying to make a series of like novellas.
Well,
Like,
look, I mean, look, if you look at the Old Testament and the ideology that emerged out of the Abrahamic religions, it was where the archons penetrated into the mindset of humanity at a certain point in history, and they implanted a
uh,
virus. And that virus is an idea that tells that person that they contacted, in this case, Abraham, that they've been selected from out of a lottery or whatever you want to call it, and they've become the people that the archons, where they just called themselves angels, Melchizedek, have been chosen to be their representative here on earth.
wow,
And as soon as that
that's
virus
so
was
true.
implanted, it created this idea that there's a certain segment of the anthropos, the human experiment that emerged out of Sophia, which are selected by an external god called Yahweh to be above all the others. And all the remaining ones are different, even a different species. In fact, it even goes so far as to say that we were created by them. So it's like it's so bent out of shape. And so, well, I mean, the thing is, all the people that are part of that tribe are in a way infected by this maligned ideology, which is causing them, if you look at the world today, I mean, it's happening right in front of our eyes. But it's no surprise to me that Zachariah Sitchin, who's one of the tribe, would support the idea that there could be a race above others. And that's why I always say master race
For
ideology,
sure.
right? It's
Yeah, I
like
think he worked for
this
the
this has
Mossad
to be
too.
stamped out of our world. This is the biggest parasitic infection of modern history. And I'm talking
Glad you
like
said
modern
that.
history, 2000 years, 4,000
Yeah.
years actually.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said
The
that.
infection took place 1850 BC.
I'm glad you said that, Frank. I couldn't agree with you more. And pe people had criticized me, like, I'm not going to mention names either, but people criticized me when I said I didn't agree with a lot of the translations. It was like mo his research, his so-called research books are written like novellas.
Yeah. Right. And then you take an Eric von Däniken who then takes a bit of it
Yeah.
the wrong story, and then he develops something on on a piece of on a thread that is very weak. You have Michael Tellinger, you have even
Yeah.
David Icke. I mean,
It's for money and entertainment.
unfortunately, they grab certain elements of the story that they want to work with, but they
Yep,
don't
that
even
fit
check
their
whether
shit.
that
That's
story
the
is on
Lego
solid
piece that
ground.
you're talking about. That's the
Yes,
Lego
the
piece.
Lego
Yep.
pieces I'm talking about. You get it, man. You totally
Yeah.
get it.
That's the Lego piece, man. That's exactly what you're talking. I agree 100%. That's why I can't see, man, the kind of life that I lived growing up. I came from a hard life. I went through different things growing up. I can't be somebody's cheerleader. The information should speak for itself. I should be able to not agree with you and still be friends and stuff too.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's not how it is out in this
Well, you have to tiptoe around. I know people. I mean, I'm a friend of Greg Braden's, and Greg Braden's putting out information that would be another version, another totally different version of creation than I would. But I still think it's cool. It's like this is
yeah.
great, Greg. Like
Yeah.
do it,
It's just
because who knows where it will
individuals.
lead. I'm doing my thing, and you should support that, you do your thing, and ultimately we should arrive at the truth, right? Because there really has to be a truth, a primal
Yeah.
truth, and so it's interesting to take an approach that everyone is entitled to their particular research. The problem happens when too much weight and importance is put upon one
Yeah.
ideology only. And unfortunately, that Anunnaki narrative has grown deep roots, so even close friends of mine, on the scene are lost in that narrative, and and they keep repeating it. It's like that they keep reinforcing it,
They
and
use the
and
word for everything.
certain ideas have a frequency, understand, and frequency is like an anchor. And if
Yeah.
you keep repeating a certain idea that isn't true, even if it isn't true, you're kind of like creating what some people call egregores, or like frequency anchors for specific ideas that aren't even true. And other people latch onto them, and they will then build their ideology upon already a faulty seed. So this is why it's so important to keep an open mind and be open to this idea of falsifiability, and to be like open to other perspectives with a healthy and happy attitude that others are
Yeah.
out there doing stuff, as long as they're not outright lying or just creating something for a purely monetary gain, or they're actually implants from the deep state to there's a lot of
Oh
that
yeah,
going
that's
on
another
in the
thing.
whole scene. What's to stop them from paying a paid actor? I mean, when you go see a movie, you believe those
Yep.
characters on screen are telling the truth.
So
And
true.
so, what would stop them from sending people within the UFO community that tell you a narrative and they're
Especially
just
when they
paid
have like book
actors?
deals invested in it and all sorts of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's like an investment, and so they basically they create this false narrative out there, and this is the problem, So and nobody's willing to everyone's tiptoeing around, like I was saying. They don't want to
Yeah, because
offend
they want to
a
be part
certain
of the club.
person.
They don't want to be. Yeah, yeah. It's unfortunate. Well, you know what, Frank? It's refreshing that your authenticity is refreshing, and that's what we have nowadays is our authenticity. If we lose that, it's like we lose everything, in my opinion. Before I let you go, one question: Do you think our souls then would be a sort of like species of plasma? That's because I'm feeling like our souls is like a type of plasma light that comes into the head of the baby, maybe wraps around the spine and impulses information to the back of the brainstem, and then when
I
that
would
gets
look at
cut,
it. I'm
that
looking at
leaves.
it almost like, well, the Gnostics talked about Sophia as appearing as the organic light, this soft light luminescence that they would enter into, and they would have these direct experiences. And
Wow.
if anything, people talk about the light within us, and the bioplasm within us, and that there's maybe a seat for a soul within our bodies directly, which is maybe that's why it has that bioplasm, that energy source, that light. So I would look at it as almost like fractality. You're getting this perspective nowadays more and more that you realize there's microcosm, macrocosm, there's fractality, meaning that the same structures, I think you touched on it earlier, keep appearing in other systems and other, represented in other materials. They're represented
Yeah.
in other gigantic, galactic structures out there. So for me, a soul could be a fractal of Sophia. And so, she actually brought us here, and so she gave birth, she gave us the soul, so we are maybe a tiny fractal, a divine intelligence she gave us that has the mandate to create novelty and explore free will. And it has absolute free will, and it actually has absolute sovereignty, because otherwise the experiment would be boring as hell. Imagine being an Aeon creating an experiment where you get like sea monkeys and you throw them in the fish tank, and you know exactly what's going to happen if you throw the sea monkeys in there, right? If you don't put in any plants or any oxygen, they're going to die, right? But what's cooler is if you don't know what the sea monkeys are going to do. You've just given them aspects of your divinity and you said, go for it and see what you sea monkeys can pull out of that aquarium, right? And one day, lo and behold, the sea monkeys might emerge in little spaceships out of the aquarium. And that was what you gave them. You gave them this divine intelligence. And that's what I think each of us has. And our soul is a little aspect of Sophia's gift to us to go out there so if there's, I don't know if there's a limited amount of souls, or maybe that's why they're recycled, because if it's an endless amount of souls, there wouldn't be reincarnation either, because where are you going to fit all those souls, right? If every soul reincarnates and constantly new souls are being born, there would be no place for them in the bodies.
It's
So I
interesting.
think that maybe there's, that there's in the Vedas, I think, if I'm not mistaken, something a number like 144,000, that number comes up. Maybe there's something to these mathematics, that there's a certain configuration of souls, but I absolutely do believe that the soul is a unique entity, and that the soul trans trans transpires into other plasmic states, if you will. That's how I would define it. I don't know it all yet. I touched on it in the Ancient X-Files and the Plasma Matrix in terms of, how the soul could work within the framework of plasma and the Kordylewski clouds. I think we have a lot more work to do in that regard, but it's certainly a very big adventure.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to more that work that you're going to do on this, and it's a pleasure to have you here, Frank. It's been too long. We got to have you on more often. Everybody, pick up Frank's book, Plasma
Sorry,
Matrix.
it's a webinar. It's not a book.
Oh, the webinar,
Yeah.
the,
The
the
master
webinar,
class.
the
The
master
master class.
class.
I'm
He's been
getting
doing
used to
these
calling it
master.
master class because they're not really webinars, they're actually courses. Like it's like a 6, 7 hour immersion
Wow,
in the
that's
topic.
better.
And
That's
yeah,
better. Yeah, I love
yeah,
that. That's
yeah.
great.
And if I count out the pages, Raw, it's about 300 to 400 pages of written material that I present to you
That's amazing. That is a
in those
book.
classes.
Yeah.
So they all could individually be books, and maybe I will one day actually convert them into
That's
written form.
amazing. And dude, you
Yeah.
go, Frank, you look amazing for your, I'm not going to say your age, but I couldn't believe your age. You barely, you haven't aged in the 10 years I've known you. You look amazing, bro. You're doing something right. And I wish you
Thank you.
health and I wish you the best. And it's a pleasure to have you on the Space Water podcast. Everybody, Frank Jacob, go pick up his master class, his seminars that he does, in fact, all the work that he goes, look into him because Frank is really, really not just a great man, but he's deep into the research. And I think plasma is the key to the universe. It's the key. It's stringing together everything. It's interconnecting. It's the lifeblood of the universe. And we're going to start to realize that more. And thank you for helping share this research. Thank you, everybody. Once again, thanks in the chat room.